Alrighty. Well, welcome everyone. Anyway, I'll go ahead and just jump right into it. We've got a lot to go through. This is just the basics overview. There'll be workshops on different topics here. All right. So one of the big things is, why are you planting? If you're planting just for ornamental appeal, then, probably just plant something that doesn't produce fruit. You don't have to worry about the bears then. However, if it's personal use, a small garden or orchard, a greenhouse, a hoop house, a commercial orchard, all those, depending what you're wanting to do, it'll really change a lot depending on what your goals are. So when you get into it, decide what your goals are for it. So the first thing that comes is assessing the site. So you need to look at your site that you're planning to plant and to look at the sunlight that it gets, what the soil is, if you need to amend the soil, how much water, if it's got good drainage, and the history of the site too. All are really good things to look at before you before you're going to go ahead and start planting something there. So we'll go ahead a little bit more detail into those different topics. Sunlight. You need to have at least 8 hours of sunlight, direct sunlight, not dappled, but direct sunlight from April 15th through September 15th. The reason why is remember that the fruit's going to ripen late, probably in August or September for most fruit. And that's when we have our worst weather, rain and cloudy weather. So it's essential that we get as much sunlight to that ripening fruit as possible, or it either won't ripen, or if it does, it'll be sour and bland. I know this from experience. I've got a tree that's in less than an ideal location and it produced fruit and it was gross. So yeah, definitely you need that 8 hours of sunlight. Sweet cherries and sour cherries, they can take a little less, but they will ripen later. Soil. So everybody knows trees, they thrive in deep, well-drained soil with sandy, loamy texture, right? Which Southeast Alaska just does not have very much of that. In fact, our soil is most often really shallow, boggy, soggy. It's filled with clay and rocks and silt. But there are ways around this, especially for a small garden or orchard. So one of the questions you want to look at when you do look at your soil, assess what kind of soil you have, and then if you're going to amend it or not. If it's bad soil, like you just poor soil, you want maybe you want to amend it, but there is a problem with amending the soil. If you only amend the soil directly around the root ball, it can lead to poor soil development. Basically, your roots of your tree hit that wall between the good soil that you added and the natural soil that's around there, the native soil, and it doesn't want to go any farther than that, because it doesn't have any, reason to. This can cause it to fall over in wind or in under a heavy fruit load. The solution that I use is top dressing. So basically, my soil here where I have my orchard, it's lousy. It's really, really rocky and sandy and silty. And a lot of clay in places too. So I actually plant my tree on the unaltered soil and then mound compost leaves, grass clippings, straw, like from the chicken coop. I mound that around the base of the tree, making sure that the trunk it's not all the way up to the trunk. And then that slowly decomposes and it feeds the tree, it suppresses weeds, and it's worked really well for me. Yeah, Rob,
I was going to say one thing about that, and that is the University of Washington came out. They've been doing studies on just putting any form of mulch on top, and pretty much the conclusion of that is that any mulch is better than no mulch out here, and they're finding increased success. Obviously, we don't have as much of a moisture issue here, but it's something to consider for sure. In fact, one of the things that they're finding that's really interesting, just to quickly include, is that they're doing studies on willow, which willow gives it the ability to overcome apple scab. And we'll talk about apple scab a little bit later, but actually they've actually found an immune response to top dressing with willow mulch. And this is a new study that just came out through the University of Washington. But one of the questions that comes out usually is, how much seaweed, because the seaweed's one of the top dressing things that come out. And a lot of people ask, well, how much seaweed can I put on? And do I need to soak it? Do I need to wash it? And the answer to that is, well, I've tried to kill them with seaweed, and so far it hasn't happened. But realistically, 4 to 6 inches around the drip line is a good measurement in the early spring. We don't want to put this too late in the season because it can create issues, too much nitrogen. And the drip line, meaning where the leaves kind of end, is where you're targeting. So the root system kind of works its way out. But as far as the salts go, there's always a talk about, is there concern about that? And my answer to that is, without any science other than my experiences, I've never had an issue with the salt buildups with our area specifically. So I just thought that would be an addition to that.
Great. Yeah, I think that we get enough rain that the salt it just is not an issue up here as far as the seaweed. Okay, so water and drainage. So when you're planting a new fruit tree or your tree is developing fruit, it needs about 1 inch of rainfall per week. And this is kind of, it's one of those things where it's hard to tell, depends how much it's had the previous weeks and stuff like that, but generally about 1 inch of rainfall. If you're worried that your tree is looking dry, go and give it a good water. But that's the general rule there. As far as drainage goes, you don't want to plant a tree in standing in a place where water stands for more than 6 hours. It's just not going to work. Basically, your tree drowns in there. So a solution to that is this picture that Rob sent. And do you want to go ahead and explain what you did there, Rob?
Yeah, it really, we've done lots of experiments on how high to actually put a mound. And there's a couple good reasons for it. Is obviously the drainage and the snow damages that we get around here. The higher the mound, the more snow that actually blows around the mound. And this picture is a really good depiction of that, which is one of the reasons why I wanted it, because you see the snow melt is happening. And here we have the mounds coming out of the snow a lot faster. So now you have a picture of some of the extra warmth gathered from the sun being on a mound, the extra drainage that you get associated with that. Not everybody can get piles of dirt to work with. And so this was more of like a 1 foot mound that I can always kind of doctor up, running mulches across the base there. So the drip line gradually, as it gradually pushes out, I can mulch around there. But we've done mounds as high as 3 to 4 feet, and the added benefit of that really is you get more exposure up and closer to the sun. Obviously, getting getting a little warmer, and also, especially for the Haines areas, the consideration is snow load. The branches, as they grow, the fruit develops, and the branches lower. And the lower the branches, the snow often catches them. And as the snow melts, it can drop and break branches. And this is a thing that a lot of people deal with, and just something to consider, one of the added benefits of a mound.
Yeah, very, very good idea. Yeah, I had a lot of problems with breaking branches last winter with all that snow load we got. Some rootstocks that can tolerate wetter soil are the Oregon crabapple, that's obviously for apples there, and the Mariana 2624, which is for plums. So there's other solutions that you can find for that. One thing with the mounds is you definitely don't want to make your mound too small. And you need to think about how big that tree is going to get, and that it needs space to grow. Otherwise, you're just kind of isolating it up there so it can freeze better, which is not good for it in the winter. All right. History of the site. Has it had fruit trees on it before, a garden or a farm? This can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on the situation. If the garden or trees are doing well, then great. Your soil is good, go for it. If, however, the garden or the trees are doing poorly, this might mean that the soil is inadequate and just needs to be improved. However, if the trees are diseased, it might mean the soil has actually been contaminated by, multiple diseases possibly, and it may not be suitable for planting trees because they would just become infected and die. So if you do have a problem where your trees, you think they have been, that they're diseased, go find somebody who can help you out, and who knows a bit more about diseases if you don't, to try to identify what's going on. All right, here we go. Choosing the right fruit. So when you're choosing a fruit and the fruit cultivar, you want to look at the bloom and harvest times, the pollination requirements, the rootstock it's on, its cold hardiness and disease resistance. How are you going to protect it from wildlife? And then obviously the type of fruits and the cultivars of those various fruits. When I say cultivars, I mean like a cultivar would be a Honeycrisp apple or a Fuji apple. Just if anyone was wondering about that. All right. So bloom time and harvest time. So you're going to want to be looking for frost tolerant or late blooming cultivars. A lot of like apples are already frost tolerant, but they also bloom later anyway, so you don't have to worry too much about them. But there are certain things like if you're going to try and be adventurous and try like a peach tree, you're going to want something that blooms later because they are very sensitive to frost. So make sure that the bloom times of the different cultivars overlap if cross-pollination is required. And you can look at the nursery recommendations for the compatible fruit trees there. We'll go into that more deeply here in a little bit. The harvest time of the fruit, that's very important in Southeast Alaska, to choose early ripening fruit and cultivars, no later than early September. Otherwise you're just not going to get ripe fruit. The exception is a greenhouse. Rob can tell you a bit about that. It'll extend the season. Can you hear me, Rob?
Yeah, I'm over here getting sidetracked with some questions I'm reading here. So we're talking about the greenhouses. The benefits of the greenhouse, which we did a course in the past. The extension of the season, the perfect fruits, the ability to actually have fruits that are storable. There's many benefits to a greenhouse that at some point, I believe there might be another presentation on that.
Yeah, we can go into more depth there in a minute here. But yeah, so if you're looking for most cultivars, you're really going to look, if you're planning to grow them outside, you really prefer to look for like August ripening or even July ripening fruit. And for sweet cherries in particular, look for fruit that ripens no later than July, or with our rains, they'll crack most often. Also a note on nurseries, when you're looking at their estimated ripening time, go to several different sites and compare what they say, because they're not always accurate, especially for up here. Add at least a month onto anything they say is actually when it's going to ripen here. But still, if you know, you want to look around a bit before you buy something to make sure that you're actually going to get a tree that's going to ripen fruit for you, because it's just sad otherwise. Pollination requirements.
And there are some that you have to watch out, because items like Gravenstein, they do not pollinate others.
This is yes. So. There are some that are not that don't. They're called pollen sterile. They don't produce pollen themselves. So we'll go ahead and so those two cultivars that you're getting, their bloom time has to overlap in order for them to cross pollinate. All right, what is a rootstock? I get this question a lot. People don't even understand what I'm talking about when I say rootstock. If you look at this picture that we've got here on the side, a rootstock is basically, I'll go ahead and read from the top here. So the Zion, or fruiting cultivar, which makes up most of the tree, is this part above. This is like what you would get from a nursery, a tree you'd get from a nursery. This part up here is the type of tree. So for instance, it's a Honeycrisp, okay? The rootstock right here, it's the roots in the lower portion of the trunk. And what this does for you is in a young tree, so for instance, this marriage works between the tree and the rootstock because it's the same, they're like an apple, okay? And apple rootstocks are like trees in their own right, but they have attributes that they provide. For instance, size, hardiness, that kind of stuff. We'll go ahead here and go into a little more detail about that. Do you want to tell us a little bit about these pictures here on grafting rootstocks, Rob?
Well, I'll give a little more on the rootstock. Something to consider with rootstocks is, as Blythe was saying, I just want to reiterate, the reason why we have rootstocks is because it helps to determine the size of the fruit tree and the hardiness. As she said, it has disease characteristics that often people, especially in our climate, you want to know about. Butagosky 118 is a one that you probably hear a lot about here. It tends to be a lot more wet tolerant, such as, or as the Oregon crabapple. But as we're talking here, Blythe's talking about the scion, the cultivar variation, and the left photo shows you pretty much what's happening inside the wood. It's actually pretty interesting. And this line right between the purple and the white here shows you the purple being the Butagosky 118 rootstock. On top of that, I believe that was a Gravenstein, but that's just kind of interesting item to see how the two cultivars mesh together and the wood grows together, and yet they still have that color differentiation in the wood itself. So this is something to consider, and if there was ever somebody had lots of time and lots of life and could create something out of that for woodworking, anyways, I consider such things. The one in the middle is a couple of these are a few experimental grafts that I've been doing here. Whip and tongue is often a very common one, or a bud graft, and I at some point there should be more discussion on these. But bud grafting is a very common one, and whip and tongue is something where they use a similar type. And here's a bud in the middle here is where the growth happens, where the leaves come out for that year. And it's just in this picture, this season we were doing an experiment, and I just thought it'd be interesting to show. This is actually the one in the middle is a taproot, grafting on taproots. And so literally taking a root out of the ground and grafting onto that and doing a wedge graft on there. And it actually works. So there's many different ways to graft on this. The one on the second to right is a variation there of an older tree trying to figure out how to get smaller wood onto a bigger tree. And what we're talking about is taking the sign wood and molding it into, or merging it into, the cambium layer, which is the green layer of flesh just below the bark, and we want those to contact or cross. And so that's what the accomplished picture is on the second, the right photo. And then on the right, what I use when I graft is a parafilm, and we wrap it, but it just kind of shows you that graft took over time. But this is just an interesting overview. I know we're just kind of rushing through this topic, but it kind of shows you a few different ideas of what's kind of going on here, things to consider. And I'm sure there've been more questions about this later on.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to grafting, and that's a whole subject unto itself, there's a lot of information there. So choosing the right rootstock, as we said, it controls, or it can help to control the tree size, its vigor, both above and below. So how much it's going to grow and how big and how fast. It'll help with the less than ideal soil tolerances. For instance, the wet soil that Rob was talking about. Cold hardiness, it can make it so your tree will survive better. Fruit production, it can cause earlier fruit production, not meaning that it's going to produce, it just produces earlier in its life. And then disease resistance also. And this picture here illustrates what some of the different rootstocks, like the apple M9, what size they get relative to a person. So it'll give you kind of an idea as what to expect from your tree when you plant it. Now, I do want to make one note about the M27. That's that smallest tree there. Unless you have ideal circumstances and are really willing to baby it, do not get that tree. It just does not have the vigor to grow in our environment. We're just don't have, our summers are just too short and our winters are too cold for it. So all the other ones seem to work really well. So yeah, just steer clear of that M27.
Blythe, on this topic, I'm seeing the questions here, and they're saying, grafting seems more advanced. That's a good question. We don't want to create more concern and confusing people, but I would say that if you're going to go with a rootstock system, there's a lot of people really wanting to do dwarf rootstocks, which are for obvious reasons, not having to get on a ladder and things. But for the Haines area, one of the reasons why we're talking about rootstocks is because size has a lot to do with the hardiness of the tree. And when they all start out, they're all small, but when they get bigger, it has the ability to overcome, well, maybe not the moose, but when they get really big, you're above the snows. You get fruit that's up higher where it's warmer, and you're overcoming some of the issues. And you can see in her chart here, the Antonovka, I've heard a lot of people say that, and this is more, well, a lot of people say it works very well for them around here. And these are only a few. There's like hundreds of different rootstocks out there. And I just want to say that, when we start talking about commercial variations, we're talking like the M9, the dwarfs, and the bud nines, and M27 is a very popular one. But these are hardy rootstocks for our area. So you'll see a lot of these terms if you order a tree outside of here. But a lot of people start with the semi-dwarfs or the standards, mostly because for many years that tree is going to take to get big, or there's other ways to keep the tree dwarfed just by pruning practices, and so, or fruiting it heavy when it gets to a certain size. And so there are some ways to keep those trees smaller, but the idea with a bigger rootstock is to get it up to size to a point so it can overcome a lot of the issues associated with the natural weather in your area.
Yes, absolutely. And like the a lot of the standard ones that apples do come on now, I mean, because of our environment, it naturally dwarfs the tree or makes it a semi-dwarf just because we don't have the same sort of growing season that they do, lower 48. So yeah, very good points. So, how big do you want your tree basically in the end, and how much time do you have to devote to it is to, consider those thoughts when you're choosing a rootstock. This particular picture is of the Anway apple tree in front of the Haines Sheldon Museum, and that tree is massive. And one of the things, this one hasn't been pruned or taken care of very well as far as being managed. And so if you look at that, you guys can see my little mouse, this is about where your head is when you stand next to it, and you can't reach the fruit. And so if you're going to get a large, standard size fruit tree, you need to be planning on doing a pruning when it's necessary. Yeah, you can't just plant it and forget about it. You need to manage that tree. Otherwise, you're going to have a tree that's too big for you to get fruit off of. If you want to go ahead and tell us about these commercial orchard shots here, Rob.
Yeah, I just thought it would be really good for people if you've never seen a commercial orchard, it's a very humbling sight when you get your little orchard and then you walk into Yakima, Washington, and it's nothing but just rows of trees. And I think it's important just to visualize what a dwarf tree looks like when it gets older. These are actually Budagovsky 9, and they were up to 18 feet, believe it or not, but they were trained in this position in a V-trellis system. And they're actually getting 40 to 60,000 pounds an acre now, which it used to be like 10,000 pounds an acre. By going by this, for this guy specifically, it was 1.5 by 11 foot spacings. And but I thought it was important for people to visualize when we start talking about commercial industry versus what, the old school, we just want to get a few trees here. Eventually, this is for Southeast. At some point, this is something we want to consider. And so, but as far as a B9 full-size tree, here's what we're talking about at some point, but they could be trained smaller. But this is the type of system that many people in the new industrial age is going to, as far as just talking about fruit production. I thought it was interesting to look.
Yeah, it's amazing. So here are the rootstock recommendations that we would make. I would go ahead and advise people to go back and look at this later on when they want to, when they have time. And it's just listed here as the different varieties: apple versus cherry versus the plum and the peach and the pear. And remember that they're always coming out with new rootstocks, and those that are rated cold hardy, they might be worth trying if you like to experiment. So there's always new ones. One of the new ones that is fairly recently is the Gazella rootstock for cherries. When before that they didn't really have anything that would dwarf a cherry tree. And so now it makes it possible to get a cherry tree that's a manageable size for the average individual instead of this monster in your backyard. So yeah, lots of stuff going on with rootstocks, tons of them out there. But yeah, this gives you a good idea of what there is.
Hey Blythe, there's two on here we should point out. I think the Reneka and Baccata, I know we talked about this for a while. Yes. Up north, this is what the northern climates, meaning like Fairbanks and Anchorage. A lot of those areas, they're targeting Renetka and Baccata, which is actually a seedling variation. And it's kind of hard. You can get the seedlings, I believe, out of Fedco, the seeds, which is pretty much a Dogo crabapple for some of these. And for the most part, when you plant a seedling, this is one of the things you got to understand about grafting and what a rootstock is. A rootstock is a clonal rootstock. Well, I shouldn't say a rootstock is that, but that you got clonal rootstocks and you got seedling rootstocks. In other words, Renetka or Baccata is two seedling variations out there often used. And in other words, you plant a seed, and when the seed is planted, it may not have the same genetics as its parent host, or what, say a Budagovsky 118, the clonal rootstock itself. They clone it, they take a stick, put it in there, put new roots on there. So it's the exact copy on there. A Renetka and a Baccata, being a seedling, often they try to keep them going through a couple seasons in the winter to make sure that it has enough the right genetics in there to get through the season. So, but those are the two rootstocks. I just pinpoint them right now because for super cold hardy areas, that's what they're targeting up north. In some areas in Haines, you might need to consider a rootstock like Renetka and Baccata if you're having a lot of issues with the other ones that we're recommending on here. So those aren't spoken about, but those two are very popular up north.
Yeah, so like Fairbanks and places like that where they get super, super cold winters. Yeah. All right. So hardiness and disease resistance. So we've spoken a little bit about hardiness before. You've heard us talk about it. So a hardiness zone indicates how cold a tree can survive. The lower the number, the more hardy. For instance, zone 3 is colder. It can take colder temperatures than zone 5. The Chilkat Valley varies in zone. We've got up the highway that is much colder. But the best choice for Haines town site is zone 5. What would you say for Hoonah area? Is that the same there?
It's 4-5.
Okay, all right. So the other factor that affects us, I mean, I've planted plants and trees that are zone 3 and 4, and they die on me. And the reason why is because they can't handle our freeze-thaw cycles. What happens is when it gets warm outside, when we have a warm period during the middle of winter, the tree starts to wake up. It starts to come out of dormancy. And then when we suddenly drop again and it's 5 degrees outside, it gets killed. It just can't survive that. And so a lot of things that do die on you, even though the zone is much, much colder than we need to be, that's the reason why. So it's a matter of experimentation too. If you're not sure about, if you like to experiment to kind of push the limits, which I love to do myself, give it a try. But if you just want a good solid tree that go for something on our lists maybe, and go for something that's zone 5 and it's going to be okay. Now, disease resistance. We don't see many up here in Alaska, but there are exceptions. And you're going to want to look for cultivars that are disease resistant, preferably, especially cherries that are resistant to bacterial canker and apples that are resistant to scab. Tell us about this photo here, Rob.
Yeah, well, I just think it's important for people to understand what they're looking at. And this is a pretty intense version of apple scab. For us, Norland, we struggle with Norland down here. In Haines, you may not struggle with Norland as much as possible because you have a bit drier climate. And so when we start talking about disease resistance, there's a number of diseases out there, but the number one top disease, I would say, would be the apple scab variations that go out. And so when you're looking for apple scab in a tree, this is kind of what you're looking at. You get some of this black sooty mold sometimes, that's a different disease, but then you get the cracking happening. You get small apples, the leaves get kind of bumpy and warty looking. And so for myself, Goodland can be a really good apple some years, but there's a lot of different ways that people spray, which I don't spray unless it's holistic options, and there are some options out there, but a lot of the lower 48 people, especially the East Coast, they spray an intense amount of chemicals out there to overcome this disease, to have the perfect apples that we see inside the grocery store. And so when we start talking about reviewing disease resistant cultivars, there are varieties that are immune to apple scab that you can get that you don't have to spray if you continue to have this issue in your area. So it's just important to note that.
Yeah, up in Haines, we don't have as much problems with it, but if we have a rainy year again, like we did this last summer, then I had a little bit of it on my apples, but not very much. But yeah, lower, a little bit lower down, Juneau, all the way down from there, it's going to be a problem. You guys get a lot more rain than we do right here in Haines. So yeah, other noteworthy characteristics when you're looking for a type of fruit there is look for descriptions that say like early fruiting or crack resistant, scab resistant, and my favorite one, will ripen in cool or maritime summers. Yeah, if it says it needs heat to ripen, don't even bother. It's not going to do it. Unless you have a greenhouse, you might have a chance, but otherwise it's not gonna work for you. Protecting your trees from wildlife and other hazards. Now, bears and moose are a real pain here. A 4-foot electric fence with a 6-joule charge should keep most bears at bay. An 8-foot physical fence will keep out the moose, unless it snows 10 feet, and then you might have a problem still. But having that physical fence around the yard, even when it's not an electrified fence, except when the fruit is actually ripening, it will discourage bears from wandering through your yard and habitualize them into taking different paths. It seems like a minor thing, but it can really help a lot. If they're not used to walking through your yard, then the chances are they're not going to walk through your yard as much. They're not going to try to walk through your yard as much. Also, having a dog or two barking in that yard is obviously even better. Birds is another bane. The robins, they always seem to appear just as my sweet cherries are ripening. If you don't put bird netting around those trees, they will strip every single cherry from that tree. Not so much with the sour cherries, but with the sweet cherries, they love them. So you can take the bird netting and cover the whole tree and wrap it around the trunk. You can use like clips for clothespin, for hanging up clothes. You can use that to clip the netting. This is what I do. Make sure every hole is closed, or they will get in and still eat every cherry that they can get down on their throats. So they are a pain. But yeah, netting really does help. And it's also a really good idea to keep trees smaller and well pruned so you can get that net over them. The next one is rodents and sun skull. Do you want to go ahead and tell us about this, Rob?
Yeah, so what you're looking at in the photo there is you'll see on the southern exposure side, there is some cracks on the trees. You'll actually see this in alder trees often. And if you're not familiar with sun scald, there's different names for it. Southern exposure cracks like this will happen often from springs happening of those nice, beautiful sunny days, and it'll just get nice and warm. And then at night, it just drops down cold. And so all of a sudden, the sap has been dormant. It just starts to flow and gets into the cambium layer, and then it freezes hard and expands, and then it cracks. And so you'll see this as a common thing, an actual killer of the trees, because once this happens, sometimes, especially in the wet climates of Southeast, you'll get disease entering into the cambium layer and bugs, and the whole process of decay starts to happen. So to prevent this, we want to paint. Usually, well, a lot of people use just latex paint. Really, that's what you really want to do. Dilute latex paint, preferably interior latex paint, and white, even a light pink if you like it. You could put whatever color you want in there as long as it's bright and some way to deflect. And so, but white is the common practice, and that is a very important thing to consider if you're going to have fruit trees, especially in a prime location. But this is what you're looking for. If you have this cracking going on, now you know what it is. And then you're looking over here. These are the voles. These are the rodents that everybody just deters. I mean, they're kind of cute little critters, but man, they do get big. And you'll notice inside the springtime, when everything starts thawing, you see all these little channels inside the grass. And if you wonder what they are, well, this is what you're looking for right here. And these little guys, if you look on where the tree is being nibbled on, this was just a tree that we threw off in the inside over the fence. And I didn't realize how many rodents over there, but there was a couple trees that they just ate that thing up during the wintertime. So when you start seeing stuff like that, it's just something to consider, is that, well, you have a rodent problem there. And what you don't want to have happen is have these little guys get onto the cambium layer of the base of your nice tree, which is why you're looking at this 1/4 inch mesh around the base of the tree. And that needs to be at least up to the snow level, because you don't want those guys to climb up and over. But generally, as long as it's down at the base, and a lot of people sometimes use 1/4-inch pea gravel and just put it at the base just to kind of keep it in contact with the ground. 99% of the time, the voles will leave you alone. They'll just kind of go around it. But it's just something that is very important in the wintertime. When you have a fruit tree, your tree may look beautiful up top, and all of a sudden the snow melts, and you have a complete girdling of the tree. And that, when that complete girdling happens from a rodent like that, it does not come back. And I've seen people distraught with even a 50% girdling, and we pretty much have to cut the tree back and regraft it for them. But it's something that you want to watch out for.
Yeah, it can be really, really bad. One thing I have discovered myself is that the rodents hate seaweed. I put this around several of my fruit bushes too, and the year before they had eaten everything to the ground. The year I put that seaweed down, they didn't touch anything. So seaweed is an option for mulching. It might be great to help keep those rodents at bay a little bit too. So good thing to experiment with. Wind. So new trees, they require support. They haven't developed the root system yet, especially in areas of a lot of wind. They need that little bit help to keep themselves from getting hammered. So you can achieve this by taking several posts and hammering them within a couple feet of the tree and tying the tree to the posts. Now you want to tie it with a rope that is not going to cut off the tree's circulation. You want something that is loose, and so that the tree can still grow, and then remove those or adjust them as needed. Some trees, especially dwarfs, will require staking for several years until the root system is firmly established, and especially if it's in a windy location. Now we've got to the fruit types. Finally, this is what we've been waiting for, right? So you're going to look for early ripening cultivars of the following. We've got apples, sweet and sour cherries, Japanese and European plums, pears, peaches, and others. These are a little bit more attention needing, that last group there. All right, so we'll go for apples first. So there are over 40,000 apple varieties out there. So what we're looking at is just a few, and it's only really the early season cultivars are the only ones that will ripen outside in our short, cool summers. So we try and class them sort of generally into two categories. So the super early sauce apples that produce a great applesauce but aren't going to really work too well otherwise, or there's the early dessert apples. So most of the sauce apples, they don't keep for more than a few days. They taste great when they're straight off the tree, and they make an excellent sauce, and often they dry well. But otherwise, they'll quickly become soft and mealy, and might be not very appealing for fresh eating. The early dessert apples, they'll keep for a few weeks up to about a month when they're refrigerated. And they're generally crispier, sweeter, and they just hold their crispiness longer. But they can also make great sauce and cooking, all that stuff too. Then there's the true keeper apples. They ripen in late October, or this is down south, and then they ripen in late October. They'll store for like 12 months or more, but there are very few exceptions they're just not going to ripen up here. There's only a few that fall into that category that actually will, and not necessarily in a normal garden situation. These are the different apple varieties that we would recommend. Do you have anything to say on this, Rob?
Well, I would say my number one experience as far as a crab apple here would be the Doggo, and Montreal Beauty's getting up there. And we try to compile a list that goes beyond my own area here, because Haines is blessed with the idea to be able to grow a lot more things, that because you guys don't have as much rain, you don't have to deal with as much apple scab. But of course, yellow transparent is a very common one. Lodi, I've had a lot of people, they had a good year and then it wasn't good. And for at least where I'm at, it tends to be apple scabby. Goodland, I know people that have said it's the best fruit ever for them, and it can be. That's a variety that they use up north. It's super hardy. It grows really well for our area, but it does tend to have apple scab. It has a lot of apple scab. Norland's another one. These are early season variations, as well as early Winucci. But a lot of our talk often goes to our Pristine and Williams, and we're starting to talk about the disease-resistant varieties. And out there's another one called Prima, and that is also a decent variety. I've grown that on one of my Franken trees, and it tends to do pretty good. It's not as sweet of an apple. I'll let you talk about Zestar, Blythe,
Yeah,
and your experiences on the others.
Yeah, the picture that's sitting there that you can see on the slide screen is actually a Zestar that I grew not this year, but the year before. And I mean, we had a gorgeous summer that year, and they turned out wonderfully. And it does depend a lot on our summer. If we have a really rainy summer like my Lodi this year, it had a bit of, it didn't have serious apple scab on it, but it did have a little bit on it. And it's basically, I think it was like kind of like a improved yellow transparent. It lasts a little bit longer, but it's basically the same thing. The Sansa, people have said that it's good, but I haven't personally had a Sansa myself. My tree got smacked by snow the last couple of years, and it's a sad little tree. Hopefully this year, right? Parkland did wonderfully for me even this year. Akani's did also wonderfully, and I think I'm pronouncing that wrong. Discovery does really well for people in Haines also. The true keepers we were talking about is the Honeycrisp and the Premier Honeycrisp. Now, the Honeycrisp you can only plant that in an ideal location. Tons of sun is the main issue that you're looking at. You want it to have tons of sun in order to ripen up. You want to tell us about the Premier Honeycrisp?
Yeah, I'll just say that, Honeycrisp, in my opinion, is kind of at the peak as far as what can ripen in our climate. That's my summation around here as far as getting something decent. And some years it's, a hit and miss like anything. But what excites me is that there's a lot of apples out there that we're not hearing about because the commercial industry or some of the, well, they have universities that are doing a lot of testing looking for that variation of apple that they can replace the Honeycrisp with, that's going to be beyond anything we've ever had in the commercial industry. And in the commercial industry, of course, they're looking for longevity, color, and flavor, that kind of thing. And a lot of these apples, they stay inside the refrigerator for up to 14 months. So now we're talking about the true keepers. Honeycrisp has gone beyond anything that's ever been out there. But one thing that I put on the list here is Premier Honeycrisp. And this was brought to me when I went to the East Coast, and I met a guy from Virginia. And he was suggesting me, he says, this is Honeycrisp that was a limb that had a different trait on it, and they just grafted it on, and they made an observation to say, well, this Honeycrisp tree is all the same as the other Honeycrisp trees, but for some reason it's ripening 3 weeks earlier. And so they took note of this one tree and started grafting in other things and started testing, and they realized it was a mutation that came off, and they classified it as a Premier Honeycrisp. And so this is becoming, I don't even know if they're using it in the stores now, but it's becoming a hot item because now all of a sudden we're talking 3 to 4 weeks earlier ripening, and that puts us in a whole different ball game in Southeast Alaska. So I start bringing this up. It's something that we all need to be kind of looking into and keeping our ears out for these little variations that come out. So I thought it's worthy to actually bring out here.
Yeah, they're always coming out with new varieties. So keep your eyes open for varieties that will do well up here that ripen early, like that Premier Honeycrisp. I mean, that's awesome. All right. Now the greenhouse. This picture was so beautiful, I could not help but put it in here. Rob, you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, it's just, we've done greenhouse presentations. Some of you have seen this stuff, but I just believe it's really just another technique that we're talking about. We got outdoor orchards, we got commercial orchards using espalier systems. We got large trees, we got dwarf trees, and all the elements out there are trying to kill, and the bears and the deer and all these things are trying to eat our apple trees. Well, all of a sudden you put them in a group house like this, and you put them in a small space, and you have These are 30-gallon pots, and I mulch them heavily with seaweed, and they get watered well. And I don't spray them with any chemicals or anything like that, but we keep them cultivated with worms so that the soil is still living where they're at. But you can see that you get perfect fruit, and all of a sudden it gives me the ability to grow anything I want in a small space, including all those ones that I can't seem to get a good apple outside. And so now you got early season apples, right? And the greenhouse gives you the ability to grow at least 1 month earlier. So all of a sudden you have early season varieties, and then a month later you have that same variety outside, and it continues from there to progress. So you can have fresh fruit for 6 months out of the year right off the tree. And so this has really given me the ability to really test a lot of varieties and expand our vision for orchards in Southeast Alaska.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, I would love to have a big greenhouse with a bunch of fruit in it. And just the idea that you don't have to worry about the birds coming in and stealing all your cherries would be awesome.
Yeah, and so, one thing, these are Honeycrisp trees, or most of them are. Some of these are Franken trees, meaning that there's more than one variety grafted on. But these Honeycrisp trees, they can turn biannual, but we're getting about 60 pounds of fruit for one tree on here. But you can kind of see how big the fruit is. So that can add up quick.
Yes, wow. This is the difference in the greenhouse between a Zestar apple and one that's grown in a greenhouse and one that's growing outside. Now, this is Rob's from his greenhouse, and this is outside from my outside garden. And you can just tell the color difference there. It's amazing. I'd love to actually compare the flavor too, and the sweetness would be great. One of these days we'll have to do that. Here's some other pictures of apples. If you want to tell us a little about them, Rob.
Yeah, these are the two on the left here. That's actually a Whim's Pride, and that's outside, even though it says greenhouse difference. But you can kind of see that's a Whim's Pride, and then the middle here, that is Pristine. So Pristine has a unique, when it starts to turn yellow, that's what you're looking for. When it starts to get a little waxy, that's when the sweetness comes in. And I threw in one other photo here. It's this reddish fleshed apple. There's a number of red fleshed apples up there that most people have never heard of, but it's important, I think, to actually consider here, because some of these things actually have maritime climate attributes to them. And anything, if you'll note that one of the observations we're making is anytime you mulch with seaweeds, they create this red fleshed trait in the fruit, more highlighting even on a red fleshed apple. And those are what they call anthocyans, which are antioxidants. But you look at that apple on there and you think, man, that looks so good. But there's a number of varieties out there. One of them, Hidden Rose. This is called the Red Geneva. There's the Red Love series out there, and those are more of a sweeter variation. So they're trying to actually perfect the red fleshed apple and create the sweetness to go with the red fleshed beauty that goes with it. And so the Red Love series seems to be the closest out there. But this is just an example. This is a Red Geneva, and they are beautiful trees. They got like purple leaves on them and red flowers. It's just something I just wanted to throw out there to just kind of open up people's eyes to see really what's out there that we're not seeing inside the grocery stores.
It looks really yummy. All right, moving on to sweet and sour cherries. So sweet cherries, again, you're going to want to look for the early to mid-season cultivars, and these are a list of the different ones. I particularly like the early burlap because it actually ripens like 3 weeks before even the rest of the mid-season ones ripen. Not the best choices on here are the ones that are very popular, the Bing, the Rainier, the Lapins, the Sweetheart. And the reason why is because they all ripen later and it normally hits our rainy season. And so they crack, and they also have a tendency to crack anyway. So look for varieties that are crack resistant and that are earlier ripening when you're going for the sweet cherries, and net them. Remember to net them. Sour cherries and Haines, basically everything works. Anything goes for the sour cherries. All of them are going to work here. The last item on there is a Duke cherry. It's actually a hybrid between a sweet and a sour cherry. And the variety is called the Almaden Duke. I'm probably pronouncing that completely wrong, but it is delicious. I would highly recommend that one. A unique flavor, different than you're expecting, but really, really good. One thing that I would like to note here, that sweet and sour cherries, there's a myth that's out there that you can get a sweet cherry and you can get a sour cherry and they will cross-pollinate one another. This is not true. And the reason why is because their bloom times are very different. Sweet cherries bloom a lot earlier than sour cherries do. So they simply can't cross-pollinate because their blooms aren't open at the same time. So if you want a sweet cherry, you either find one that's self-fertile or find two, and then get yourself a sour cherry too. But yeah, so just a little note there. Japanese and European plums. So the Japanese, are also known as Asian plums, again, the early to mid-season cultivars. You can see there's not as many varieties here, mostly because a lot of the plums are either not very cold hardy or they ripen too late. So these ones are the ones that I would recommend that I've had success ripening here in Haines, except for the Arctic plum, or otherwise known as a Hoonah plum. But Rob says that's a great one too. European plums, they are, again, early to mid-season cultivars. These ones have done really well for me too. The Italian prune is probably the latest one that you're going to look for. It barely ripens in time, but it does ripen. Hybrid plums. Now these are crosses between Japanese and European plums and other kinds of plums. And they also do very well up here. They're really great. Not the best choices that I've run across so far are Superior or Toka plums. They ripen just a little bit too late. Unless you have them in a greenhouse, then they'd probably be fine. And pluots. Pluots need a lot of heat to ripen and be tasty. So I wouldn't recommend the pluots. Pears, peaches, and other fruit. European pears, you're going to look for extremely early cultivars, ones that ripen in June and July. I cannot say the names of these ones. I don't speak French. But Aragonchi and these other ones are just great. This little fruit right here ripened this summer for me. It's a Juliet pear. And it was delicious, really, really good. But the one thing with the European pears is they do require an ideal site. You need a lot of sun to get them to ripen. Peaches, so far I have heard of no success outside of a greenhouse with a peach. I do have one in a mostly enclosed greenhouse, and it does fine. There's also somebody else in Haines that has another one that she gets fruit off of it also. But again, only if you've got a greenhouse. I am gonna try growing some outside again this year. So far I have not been successful with that, but I persevere. Some oddball fruit trees is the dwarf shapova. It's a pear-like fruit. It's actually this one right here. And it is a cross between a type of mountain ash that we don't actually have here in America, and a pear. This cross happened like 300 years plus ago. And it produces this delightful fruit that is really, really yummy. And so I would highly recommend that if you want to try that. But you're looking specifically for the dwarf shapova. Regular shapovas, they take way too long to fruit. Not recommended are apricots, nectarines, or anything that requires heat to ripen. I love apricots, and I have tried. Even the super, super hardy ones have not survived. I think I'm on the count of like 5 or 6 that have died on me now. So yeah. Anything to add to that, Rob?
No, other than, the same thing with the peaches. I haven't had anything outside yet, but we did get good peaches in the greenhouse as well. And European pears, all the pears, there's a lot of varieties out there. I once gave up on it, and then I ran to a pear grower in Wisconsin, and he kind of encouraged me. There's a lot of, again, early season variations we often don't hear about. So some of these things are just worth trying. You get one tree, and if you learn how to graft, it's worth getting a multi-variety tree to see what exactly works for you. And one thing to know with pears is that bees do not like to pollinate pears. Don't ask me why. They just don't seem to like the pollen. And the same thing with plums. And you just need to make sure if you get a plum tree or get a pear tree, you want the branches pretty much to cross. Or if you can only get one, you need to do a multi-variety tree, or as they say, Franken tree. I've said it a couple times just because it's kind of a freaky tree. You can put all kinds of stems or whatever on there. You want cross pollination happening. Like for those two variations, pears, and plums to actually literally be touching, because you can't almost rely on the bees around here for those varieties. Yeah, somebody just made a note about the greenhouse, and I'll just say it because I'm trying to multitask. But the bumblebees seem to be don't ask me how, but they find our greenhouse. Somehow they find out how to get in at the right time. But we have bumblebees getting in our greenhouse, pollinating our trees. And it seems to be it's the first thing that comes out as the apples in our greenhouse before the blueberries. And so they find it. It's a miracle to me. But sometimes I don't rely on that, especially on like Zestar. And that one I'll hand pollinate. I'll just find whatever I can get in there, and I'll just grab one flower from one different variety, cultivar of apple, and then rub noses and go through it and just quickly brush through and make sure I'm getting a few apples on there.
So a little bit hard-earned wisdom that I've come across in over the time that I've been raising my orchard and learning stuff. To apples, to thin the newly set fruitlets aggressively, you'll get fewer but much bigger and better tasting apples. This is also true of plums. If you let them overbear, it can kill the tree. So it's important also to besides breaking branches, it can possibly kill the tree, especially when they're young. Cherries, again, I said sweet and sour cherries will not cross-pollinate because they don't bloom at the same time. Sweet cherries on the Gazella rootstock, they have a tendency to overbear fruit, especially when they're young. So you'll actually need to thin the fruitlets. Again, on those sweet cherry varieties, again, same reason it can possibly kill the tree if you don't do that. Plums, the Japanese plums, they grow faster, but the limbs are spindly and they break easily under snow load. So those need to be pruned aggressively, and we'll have another workshop on pruning and when to do it and how to do it and all that stuff. So keep an eye open for that. European plums are much sturdier and they're easier to grow, but they also fruit later in the season. But if you want something that you don't have to pay too much attention to as far as pruning, then I would recommend the European plum over the Japanese or one of the hybrids. Some general tips, don't let your new tree bear fruit too soon. So for the first couple of years, all the energy that tree is producing needs to go into making strong branches and roots. I know it can be really hard to resist the idea of fruit, but you will, in the long run, you'll be much happier if you pinch off those fruitlets that set. And where to order. So this is a list of different locations that you can order trees from that we know of and that we would recommend. Locally is Gomez Garden, that's Sabine Churchill's place here in Haines. Alaska Apple Farms, that's Rob's. Ed's Edible Landscaping, are they from Juneau, out of Juneau? Do you know?
Ed Barsky.
Okay.
You got the thumbs up.
Yeah, and Landscape Alaska also. Places down south you can order from: Rain Tree Nursery, One Green World, Burnt Ridge Nursery, Fedco Trees, and Four Winds Growers if you're interested in tropical trees like citrus and stuff like that. Those, again, are going to have to be inside. But they do have some other varieties, too, of ones that would go outside. When you want to order is going to be now. Generally, you want to order in December or January. Remember, down south, they can plant already, especially in like if they're in California and warmer states. So they're going to get their trees early and they're going to plant them and they're going to order them early. So if we want to get ours reserved, you need to order them as soon as you can. Check reviews before ordering. So if you find a new nursery, check it out. Look for reviews on it. Make sure that it's legitimate. If the prices are too good to be true, it's probably a scam. And sadly, there are many irresponsible nurseries and quite a few scams out there. So, just keep your eyes open if you're gonna order from some other place. Anything to add to that, Rob?
We covered a lot. Just backing up one slide. Just wanted to say too, hybrids are something definitely to consider. Hybrid plums, and what those are is the American to Japanese variations, and there's a few out there that seem to actually work for us. One of them being Black Ice. And then there's Conchico is one that I found, but there's a number of new ones that seem to come out, and they were able to pollinate hybrids through a greenhouse, getting the bloom times to be the same. by altering the bloom time, which normally in nature wouldn't happen. So they made a hybrid by making the bloom times the same and then be able to get fruit off of that. So I just want to throw that out there. Don't be afraid of them because they seem like they could be a good thing.
Yeah, I have noticed that they do have a lot of winter dieback.
They
The
do.
Japanese plums, especially in Haines, we do get the colder temperatures. So yeah.
Which when you say that, hard-earned wisdom, I had a question on here that I want to just, when do you mulch? And, mulching is important, but we really want to do that for the most part all year long. But when you do the seaweeds, you want to make sure you do it earlier than later. You don't, because it has a lot of nitrogen. You get a lot of sea creatures that go into the ground there and putting a lot of nitrogen in there, which is a good thing, except when you have nitrogen and the growth does not harden off during the winter time and you got all this green flesh vegetation and all of a sudden it snows, those tips on the new growth from last year, they will freeze and they'll have winter damage on them, and in fact the leaves don't come off. That's when you know that there's too much nitrogen often in the system, when the leaves just don't come off and it's winter time and you're getting through Christmas and you're like, well, why is it still green? And that can actually kill the tree and you'll have a lot of winter die off. So when that happens, you want to make sure to strip the leaves off. That's what I do, because your winter will just kill the thing. And I've had plum trees that have just kind of fallen apart due to snow. So that was my last hard-earned wisdom. I know we got questions, but somebody did ask that. I thought it was important.
And I think, yes, thank you for attending. The next shop is going to be on planting those fruit trees. So you can get more information on that, how to plant them. That's Saturday, January 29th at 4. It's also on Zoom. Remember, you do need to register again for that next presentation if you want to do it. And a little information there on what it's about. We're going to go ahead and open up for questions now. And I'm going to go ahead and switch back to this. We can go ahead and look at some of the images if anybody wants to address a particular topic there. Let me go ahead and switch the way this shows so I can see people. And yeah, do we have any questions? I'm not sure how, I can't see everybody that's on here.
Hey, Blythe.
Yep.
Hey, Blythe, Ed's got a something on the chat here. I think it's good to say that, the seaweed now is a good thing.
Yes.
It's when the leaves are off, trying to get that seaweed mulch on there and getting it, breaking down during the winter is a good thing. It's just, we don't want to do it late in the fall, somewhere after July, especially. We want to be careful on how much nitrogen goes into the soil. And like I said, the indicator is your green leaves just don't go away in the fall, and that creates an issue.
Folks can raise their hands right on the side screen. I can, if you have your hand up, there's a way to do that. You can, I can pick you.
Okay.
And of course, you'd be unmuted if you want to ask a question verbally.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, if somebody wants to, Rob, if you want to,
Yeah, go ahead.
My interface is not working very well, so I can't see everybody. If you want to.
Yeah, I got Richard.
Yeah. One question, what would you suggest regarding recently cleared land? You have spruce and hemlock trees. If you were to clear an area like that, would the soil, acidity affect new fruit trees? Do you have anything to say on that?
Yeah, we just did this. Really, a apple tree, it's a deciduous tree, and so soil tests are important. And over time, if you don't have access to a soil test right away, liming for myself in my area, I put a lot of lime where we're at, and I pretty much burned our whole orchard area trying to get the ash to go into the soil. And then of course, biochar is something that a lot of people are getting crazy about. And so you wanted to turn it into a deciduous ground. And so I actually added alder chips. And this is why I brought out the whole idea or a statement about what Washington, the University of Washington was coming about, and they were doing the study on just putting chips on around fruit trees and big orchards. And of course, down there, they've got industries that are actually just chipping trees and then they're disposing of them, and they're saying, hey, come on over, dump it on my lot here, and I'll take care of it for you, or they'll give them a beer or something. And so they got access to this, and that whole concept right there, they found out, like I said, that they did a study on it. The willows have the ability to create an immune response on fruit trees, especially for our apple scab. But it's hard to really answer your question, but I would suggest definitely do a soil test. And when I plant a tree, I'm looking for a certain amount of growth in a season, at least 12 to 20 inches at least in the season. If I'm not getting that, I'm only getting a little stub, like a 4-inch growth, especially, I know I got an issue, because even on a wet season, there should be more growth on a tree than that. So you're looking for thick fruit spurs and buds on your limbs. But really you need to get a soil test, and you want to get I believe it's 6.5 is what we're looking for pH. You can do pH tests on there. That's really important. pH is an indicator of what your plants can actually absorb. It's important to have a good pH for your trees. So you want to replicate as much of a forest line deciduous as you can. And when you clear a land, you're stripping everything. But what you don't want to do is clear it and just leave it like I did for a year. And now I'm really trying to get everything back in there. And what I mean by that is that when you first clear it, all that stuff that gets broken down, it's all nutrients. It's all right there. You don't want it to just leach away. So it's really important that you plant it and then mulch it to try to keep it there. So it's not just washing away, or do a cover crop. And that'll help to build your soils. But it usually takes 3 or 4 years to get your soils where it needs to be. And I know Ed would probably have a lot to say about that when you're talking about planting trees.
I'll just say a word there, that the concept of basically orchard compost as being different than garden compost is an important one. And Rob mentioned deciduous wood chips. If you look online, you'll find a topic that's called ramial chipped wood. And generally speaking, the orchard compost focus is on deciduous, high lignin, small diameter stems. And we're going to talk about that, and that will be part of the presentation on planting fruit trees, because the basic concept of a holistic orchard approach is built around a real focus on the mycorrhizal fungal duff layer, which is very important to the health of the plant and how it is able to access nutrients.
Thank you.
Folks have any questions, please?
I see one in the chat that's from Joe Feldman. I would like to rejuvenate my existing fruit trees, all hardy and established in Haines. They are all old and struggling badly in need of pruning. I would like to reserve them. What would you recommend for pruning in the Anway apple, a yellow transparent, same era as the one at the Sheldon Museum? Also, what rootstock would be best to graft the yellow transparent onto? So that's going to be into the pruning workshop.
Right. Also with Joe's question, it really deals with the size of the trees. Joe, you're asking a question about rootstock, which is this question about the vigor of the tree. Is it a big nutrient hog that's going to grow a big tree, or is it a tree that's a rootstock that's going to grow a small tree, or one in between? So thinking about that rootstock slide, which you can access on the website, this slideshow will be, and this recorded program will be on the website in a few days.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Hey, Burl, I want to say something, because this is actually a very good question, in the fact that a lot of people don't know how to prune. And I would recommend, because there's a lot of ways to prune. We can prune to just landscape it. We can prune to get the tree down. But the first thing that an arborist, certified arborist, will tell you is you need to look for the dead and decay. Get rid of the dead and decay wood, and this pruning will come up eventually. But I would really caution people, especially for an older tree, is that if you haven't done it, get somebody that knows what they're doing for the first time at least. Even if you got to pay them whatever it costs to do it for an older tree, you will be so much happier, because there's ways to induce fruit, create fruiting. There's ways to preserve the tree so that you're refreshing the fruit spurs on there, and there's ways to cut it back so far that you create a stimulus of just flush growth, that it goes actually into a vegetative mode, and you're creating more problems, and all of a sudden you're trying to hack at the tree and you can never seem to get ahead of it. And so it is a huge topic, is what Blythe and Brill are trying to say, that at some point should really get discussed with some photos. But for an older tree, especially a historical tree, I try to tell people, and there are some people I can recommend, or myself if I was there, you definitely want for the first time, if you would consider a tree like that, to have them go through it with you if you're really trying to preserve it.
Especially if you're completely unfamiliar with pruning, then you're really going to want somebody who's there who can look at it and say, okay, this is what needs to be done. Is this, and what your goals are, like you were saying, what do you want done with it? There is a question here about the dwarf Shapova, and is it self-fertilizing? So it is partially self-fertile, but with skepticism associated. One of the biggest problems with the dwarf Shapova is that they're not entirely certain what pollinates it. I do have it next to a late blooming pear, but I've noticed that it set fruit when the pear didn't bloom. So, but I have quite a few, so I'm not entirely positive with the Shapova. It does seem to be partially self-fertile. So I'll go ahead and leave that question at that.
May I jump in on that one?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps. I read about this Shapova when they first came out 15, 20 years ago. They say it was a cross with some mountain ash. So I know there's lots of mountain ash up there in Haines, among other places. And they say, and I have had no luck, grafting pears onto mountain ash. So there's some, they're all in the same family distantly. So that's a slight possibility too for some pollination. And maybe they are partially self-fertile, kind of like the yellow transparent apple.
So in my research, when I was doing a bunch of research for the dwarf Shapova, the mountain ash variety that it's actually is not the mountain ash that we grow here. It's actually called a white bean, and it's a European mountain ash type. So I don't know if our mountain ashes, I've read all over the place, people plant them next to mountain ashes and they do nothing. So I don't, it is a big question with the Shapova. It may or may not be, who knows?
Can I ask a question?
Sure, go for it.
Hello, this is Larry Lander from Gustavus. I think that when he was talking about sun scald, Rob said that the longitudinal cracks down the bark of the tree was due to sun scald. Is that correct?
Yes, that particular picture is a picture of sun scalding.
And so that sun scald was like up in the branches, like I've painted my trees up to the first branch, but they've got that. So are you wrapping white tape around the rest of your trees in the wintertime?
No. When that happens, if you ever see tape on my trees, it's probably because I'm trying to fix a problem. But yeah, you made a good observation. And if you look at the crack, it goes all the way to the base of that limb. And I've seen it go up even 3 to 4 feet into the tree. And so you really want to paint that tree up as high as you can deal with and make it artistic, because I know some people don't want to see a painted tree in their yard, but there is a good reason for it. This particular picture is on a doggo crabapple, which doggo is pretty hardy, but it obviously had an issue in this picture. It's just the location, and every location's a little different. I've got other apples that I've painted and I've just kind of let them go and they've eventually washed out and it just never had an issue. Doesn't mean I won't have an issue because I've let the paint kind of do its thing. But especially while they're younger trees tend to be more, they don't have a thick bark on them. have this problem. But what I did when this happens, when you start asking about tape, in my own desperation, if I catch it early enough, if it just happened and I say, oh man, it just cracked and you can still see green in there, I will take tape, which for me, I usually use a product called parafilm. That's what I use to graft with. But if you don't have parafilm, go ahead and get some of this flagging tape or something and just wrap that branch tight. Just get that thing, the cambium layers to set tight. And in desperation, if you catch it early enough, it'll actually regraft itself back. But if it sits too long, the bacteria gets in there, the air, and then the bugs, and the cambium layer dies, and then you got a problem. And for my solution for this, I don't have another photo, but this is a few years later. I've had to actually, what'll happen is the dieback will happen in the cambium, and you'll see this brown scar starting to form with a callus where the green cambium and the dead cambium meet. You want to take a knife, and I actually score it out. I actually take that and I cut it out, because what'll happen is you want to scrape all that cambium out of there and get that wood drying and just get it exposed to the air. Otherwise, you'll end up with a fungal decay and a place for bugs to get in there. And that's really all you can do at that point. And sometimes the tree will throw out a bunch of suckers out, and they call it bypass grafting. Now we're getting complicated. But realistically, at that point, you really want to manage the rot at that point. But it's something to pay attention to.
I've noticed some varieties are much more susceptible to this sun scald than others too. And so if you notice a particular variety is just keeps getting it, then maybe steer clear of that. Maybe try again with a different variety. But yeah, I do have one tree that does it, even though it's protected, and it seems to still be surviving. So I'm like, okay, but yeah, it can be a definite problem. There is one question here from Jameson Kahn. Top dress swing with sawdust and chicken manure is his question. So no, the sawdust will acidify your soil. So I would highly recommend probably not using that sawdust unless you really know what you're doing. And chicken manure needs to be, if it's, you don't want it, you can put a little bit on. If it's like used straw that has a little bit of chicken manure on it, then it's okay. But if it's like heavy, thick chicken manure, you do not want to use that. It's too rich and will actually burn your tree. So you don't want to do that either. So you need to let that compost for a little while. But yeah, other manure I normally use is duck manure. You can throw that on right away, and rabbit manure, you can throw that on right away.
These other questions, feel free.
One thing that's important though is the difference between sawdust and remedial wood chips.
Yes.
And there's a lot of people, I mean, the understanding is that wood, when you put wood chips on, or any type of wood, it pulls nitrogen out. And there's a lot of studies now, they're going back and saying, well, that could be true. It kind of keeps it back for a year. But after a season, when the decomposition happens, and we're talking about fruit trees here, not for gardening and stuff, but for fruit trees. Going back to that study, a Washington study, they're saying, well, once that compost starts, realistically, it's better to have wood chips. We're talking like remedial, meaning it went through a wood chipper, like maybe 1 inch and above wood chips. And wood chips actually are preventative. They're finding that the remedial wood chips, it's a deterrent for voles as well. But it's just important to distinguish between sawdust, because the sawdust just doesn't get the air inside of it that it would. But a little bit of sawdust is fine. I mean, I mix it around, and you mix it with stuff, and it'll eventually do its thing. So
just not heavy sawdust. You don't want to do that.
Yeah.
You're smothering it then. There's a question here about growing. Is it necessary to paint trees that are growing in high tunnels to prevent sun scald?
Yeah, I put on there, I've not experienced sun scald in the greenhouse, but I have painted plenty of trees in the greenhouse as a preventative, not wanting to kill my trees. But I have never seen it in the greenhouse, and I've done this for about 12 years now. So,
yeah, if it was me, I'd paint them just because I'm twitchy.
You're welcome. Leaves.
Yes, composted chicken manure with the sawdust. If the sawdust isn't too much sawdust and if it's been composted down, that would probably work. Don't mix it into your soil, just put it as a top dressing on top. That would probably work.
Yeah, and if leaves have remained in high tunnels still, should you pull off? You know, you don't have to. It's really becomes an issue. Eventually the leaves will come off in the high tunnel. They do. And what they're asking you to do, well, a tree, I don't want to say asking, but it's after a while, the leaves, they'll die off, but they just sit there. And if you just take your tree and shake it a few times in the middle of winter, you know, we don't get wind in the greenhouse. So I don't usually take the time to strip them in the greenhouse. You teach high school. Hey, Burl, you got an answer to, I teach at Sitka High School.
Yeah, I am actually. Oh, I'm emailing Megan, and I will just simply ask them that maybe they should contact Darren about that. There is a. I don't have it current information. Darren might have a better handle on that.
I'll say one other thing that's really, really important that we often overlook, and you know, cambium layers on trees. That is the life flow of your tree, and we talk about not killing our trees. You know, sun scalding. We don't, you know, that's an issue, but weed whackers are a big issue. And we forget about talking about it, but human error, trying to baby your tree and make that perfect, you know, no grass area over there and a weed whacker, get a little closer. This is where the little 1/4-inch mesh comes in. We got to just kind of get out of the mentality of having that perfect setup, and it takes a little bit of work, but go in with your hands and pull them out, but don't hire the neighborhood kid to come over and kill your tree for you and wonder what just happened. So it's just something that we don't always think about, but it happens all the time. So weed whacker disease.
You know, somebody asked earlier a question about a reference or a book or something, and Ed had a name of an author in our conversation the other day, Ed Byarsky, who will be the presenter with me with the second workshop, Planting Fruit Trees, on Saturday, January 23rd. But certainly one is going to be a presenter in our program in March. He'll be presenting on the 5 tenets of the holistic orchard, is the author Michael Phillips. And his environment is very different. He's from New Hampshire with that deep loamy soil and all that stuff, which we don't have up in Haines in the Chilkat Valley area. But the level of knowledge and good writing in his book, The Holistic Orchard, Fruits, Tree Fruit and Berries the Biological Way. 1. 2, his new book is on the mycorrhizal world. It's called Mycorrhizal Planet. And then his first book was called Apple Grower. But just really, really great stuff. And it's worthwhile having it on your bookshelf if you're at all serious about this stuff. And I would recommend to anyone to get a good reference for fruit growing.
We've got somebody asking how they can access this PowerPoint for reference. It's going to be on the website, right, Burl?
Right, that's right. So give me a few days, probably Monday or Tuesday, when I figure out how to do it, and it'll be posted on a new page on the cvorchardproject.org site, and it will be under resources. And there it will be for workshop 1. This will be a recorded program.
And I saw an earlier question about how, what was the best way to protect against snow load, and, you know, ruining your trees. I think probably the best, if you're not into going out and babying your trees during the winter, the best is to get a larger tree, a semi-dwarf at the least, and to prune it. To prune it well, make sure you're pruning out the skinny little branches and make sure it's got a good framework. That's your best defense against snow load.
To add to that, Blythe, you know, you'll learn when the snow damage is going to occur over time. And what you're looking for is you have those really nice fluffy snows, and then it warms up right after. And that's when the warming, the wet snow grabs those branches and it drops because everything's melting. It locks in the branches and it drops. And so when you have smaller trees and you got limbs that you're caretaking at a lower, below 3 feet or so, you're going to have to watch that. And what I do is I just go out there and I'll have to just kind of work them out of the snow and make sure they're upright. But those are the conditions you're looking for of when it's generally going to happen, is when you have that fluffy snow going to wet snow, and it drops and it pulls those branches and strips them. And so another method would be the mounds. The higher the tree is up, the less the branches will be in, especially if you have a higher mound. And not everybody can do this, but it is something, especially in Haines, to consider. If you don't have good soils, the mounds will help you to be able to get more soil depth, but it will also get you out of the higher snows. So hopefully that can answer.
One of the problems that we have in here in Haines, because we get so much snow here, it'll be fine. The snow will be fine. It'll be fluffy and it'll be just fine. It snows 3 feet out there. You go out there and your trees that were huge trees are just barely sticking out of the snow. And then you have some beautiful days and the snow starts to melt down. And what happens is, as that snow melts, any branches that are caught under it, just like when it snows that wet thing, it grabs it and it pulls them down and it'll rip them off. So go out there, dig out those branches carefully. When it's really cold out there, or when those branches are frozen, they can snap off really easy, particularly apples and pear and plum trees will snap off really easy. So you want to be really careful and dig those branches out if you can. Is there any other questions we got there?
Well, this has been wonderful. I'll just jump in. We've been at this for an hour and 45 minutes here, just about. And please, if there are other questions, now is a good time to ask them.
Just speak up if we can't. If we not seeing you raise your hand.
Make sure that your mute button is off. Okay.
Hi there. Can you
go
hear
ahead,
me?
please.
Yes, I can hear you.
Nene or someone else?
You, Nene.
Yeah, you,
Okay.
Nene.
Well, my husband planted a lovely orchard of 15 trees, and I haven't a clue how to take care of it. And all the things you mentioned with the leaves staying on, two or three of the cherry trees, leaves stayed on. I don't know if they're still on. And anyway, I kind of need help and direction on how to take care of that over the winter and what I should be doing.
Where are
I'll come
you?
by. She's here in Haines. I'll give you a call, Nene. We'll talk about it.
I'm in Haines on River Road.
Okay, perfect. Okay.
All right. Thank you. Great presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Anybody else out there?
I see, Laura, you have a question in the chat box. Are there certain fruit tree varieties that would prefer to be planted in the fall?
The short answer to that is no.
Well, Ed Byarski, generally the answer to that for our area is no. I'm sure there are exceptional situations.
Hey, Burl.
Yeah, go ahead.
It depends on who you talk to. There's actually the whole commercial industry is rounded around planting bare root trees in the spring. A lot of that is because they're harvesting the trees in the middle of the winter or early fall, and then they're putting them in storehouses, getting ready to sell. And so then they become available in the early spring. That's when everybody's thinking about buying a tree. However, fall time, if you talk to any of the people in the background, that fall time is actually a really good time, believe it or not. It's because of when the roots are starting to really go down. It's already done its cycle. But I plant trees in the fall all the time, personally, and I haven't had any issues. So we plant during the summer, but fall is not a bad time.
I'll jump in on that one if I may.
Yeah, go for it.
So, I told you, Burl, that I plant a tree this week. Have my wife take pictures of me planting a tree since the ground was thawed and there's no snow, and you thought I was joking. But we did it yesterday. I actually
Yep.
planted it in a garden box, which it's not going to stay there, but it's for the reason, well, it was very convenient. Incredibly beautiful soil. And as I was digging, planting, thinking, oh man, this tree would take off just beautifully. Yeah, I don't intend to leave it there because I want to plant or grow some more vegetables there. But now I'm having second thoughts that I might actually plant a second tree 8 feet away from it in this 4-foot wide garden box. Again, last year, every year is different. This year, our snow is pretty much gone. It feels like spring, 40 degrees. There's no frost in the forecast for the next 10 days. The tree that I planted was dormant. Actually, I had multiple trees left over from last spring. They were in a big tub. I pulled one out and planted it. And it was dormant. Soil was cool. It's not likely to grow much for roots at this point, but it is, we'll talk about this in 2 weeks probably. But it is, it will be waiting, the roots will be waiting when the soil warms up a little more, and they will get probably a little bit of an extra head start in the spring. I mean, in places like Ketchikan, you could probably plant them year round because they don't hardly freeze. And Sitka is another place. Again, the problem is getting the trees. So it's the sort of thing, if you had trees, you didn't get around to planting them last April, May, June, July, August, again, the conditions are right. Ground is not frozen, trees are dormant, plant them if you can get them.
Yeah, to clarify my answer, yes. Yeah, if you have the trees and they're sitting there, go ahead and plant them if they're dormant. In Haines, generally, it's too cold. We can't do it.
Or buried in snow, you'd have to shovel 3 feet of snow away to get to the ground. When then the ground is probably not frozen underneath 3 feet of snow.
It may or may not be. It's one of those things.
Right.
Depends how the snow came down. But the other thing that happens is that, like, if you're ordering fruit trees to plant in the fall, they will ship them too late. They'll get, at least in Haines here, they ship them too late for us to get them in time to plant them. And so generally I would say no. I've tried it a couple times and I've had much more mortality here in Haines. The places where where the ground doesn't freeze, like Ketchikan and places like that, you're probably fine to plant right now. Yeah.
And again, part of it also might be, if this, assuming it's not an emergency thing, but rather you're planning for this. If the nursery says, yeah, we'll ship the tree in October or November, is that you can plan by throwing multiple tarps on top of the ground, which might keep your soil a little warmer and drier. I had to do that with some garlic this fall. It was late ordered and we got that early 10 inches of snow in October. I thought, oh, I'm in trouble. But I had tarped it, had multiple tarps, got the garlic, shoveled off the snow, pulled back the tarp, planted the garlic, covered it back up again, and shoveled some more snow back on. And of course, now our snow is gone again. So it's hard to plan to do that.
Yeah, I mean, if you're gonna, to be safe, I would plant in spring, is what I would say. If you need to, go ahead, and if your circumstances permits, you can plant in the fall, but just be careful.
And otherwise, if you get potted trees that are from local sources or whatever, or you just can't do it, put the tree in the pot in the spring, and then whenever you have time, plant them when you can.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, it's, as far as in my experience in Haines here, because our winters are a lot colder like they are in Hoonah and stuff. My experience has been that trees in pots don't do very well. So if you've got a tree that's sitting in a pot, go ahead and put it in the ground. If it's in the fall, put it in the ground. It'll do much better there.
I have a question.
Yes, Stephanie?
Miss Scott?
Thank you. And this is a question that Burl will probably relate to. We have a very old orchard here. It might be 20 years old, and it's built on clay, solid clay, and it doesn't always do very well. But so my question is, what do you do when your soil is clay?
Okay. Well, I would, well, Rob Bishop, it sounds like you've got quite a bit of experience with that. Is that what you're dealing with?
Yeah, well, I'm sure everybody's got ideas, but the clay is really the issue with that is if the clay doesn't hold the water surface, you only have so much root surface. The roots spread out and they don't really go down deep. But my suggestion, if you've already planted it and you haven't done a mound system, if you have a real clay hill and you're just about to plant, this is where the mounds kind of falls in, because you're looking for soil that is more loamy, drainy. But for you, I would recommend consider doing the mulching technique. Really consider it, because that's really at that point, in my thought, that's you're building the soils, you're creating earthworm habitat. Which the worms they help in the drainage. They help break up the soil. They do all the things you can't do in the soil, and so clay is there. It holds moisture. As long as the trees are growing, in my opinion, I would consider really doing a heavy mulch on there. And I know that can be considered a lot of work for, I don't know how big of a site you have, but pictures show 1,000 words, but from what it sounds like, that would be my recommendation at this point. And Ed, you probably have a lot of ideas on that too. So.
I agree with what you're saying. I mean, clay, if the clay, yeah, like you say, if you can somehow could have broken up the clay or penetrated the clay or whatever, that would be great. And the worms will go down into the clay and move up and down for the organics and help break that down. But the adding the material on the surface, as long as you don't pile it up too high, and again, don't pile the material up against the trunks, but putting it out there, putting the mulch, the compost, the seaweed, all that good stuff out there around the drip line, again, you're going to stimulate more root growth out there. And which you do that, and you're going to stimulate more top growth. And then you're going to need to do more pruning, and then you're going to need to do more fruit eating, we hope.
That's the whole point, right?
Well,
yeah, it's a vicious circle.
Stephanie's question is pretty personal, because Stephanie and I help Stephanie when we share this orchard space. And we did plant this last spring, we planted in that little orchard a Antonovka rootstock with a pristine apple grafted on top of it. And we mounted up about, we put probably about a 1 foot mound there above the surface. So I had to bring soil in. And that will mean that as the tree grows and as the canopy develops, you'll be mulching the drip line and extending the roots development. The feeder roots are close to the surface. The surface feeding of the plant is really, really important in growing that mycorrhizal community along with the tree.
We have a question about chestnuts and other nuts that we could grow here. So I am doing an experiment with a chestnut tree, but it'll be a while before I see if I actually get any chestnuts off of it that are ripe. Most chestnuts ripen too late, and they need a really warm summer to ripen. But like I said, I like to push the limit. So I'm trying a couple. They also have very complex pollination, so look into that before you buy any. Other nuts, I've heard of like hazelnuts or filberts. I haven't actually been successful yet. The trees are surviving, they're fine, but whether or not we'll actually produce anything. Do you know anything about that, Rob?
Chestnuts there's a great big chestnut by the governor's mansion, I believe. Ed, isn't that right?
Yeah, but yeah, unfortunately, that's horse chestnuts, and there's several others in Juneau, and they're not edible for humans, unfortunately. Now, on other nuts, I have a friend who lives in North Tea Harbor. She's about 2 miles as a crow flies from me. She has a couple of Carpathian walnuts, which she has actually, well, in the 2019 summer, which is record breaking, she got a tremendous crop. And actually they did, I've eaten a couple. I didn't get back to her place that year. And the squirrels here haven't figured them out yet. She has had some luck, but these trees are 25 years old at least, and almost 10 to 12 inch diameter trees, big trees. Then I have supplied some small plants of hazelnuts to American hazelnuts to folks in Skagway who have told me, and I can't remember the fellow's name, unfortunately, who he said he has had success with them in Skagway. Of course, Skagway is different than Haines and Juneau and all the rest of us too. And in Skagway, I know folks, I've seen the pears and the pictures of the pears, and they do well in Skagway. So again, much drier. I mean, Skagway's a desert compared to us.
Skagway and Haines, we have a lot less rainfall than the rest of Southeast, so we can get away with things that
yes.
Can't.
Yep.
The next question here is regarding bush cherries. I did grow a couple bush cherries and they never fruited for me. I don't know if it was the variety. They would flower, but they would never set fruit. So I've kind of steered away from bush cherries. Why do a bush cherry when you can just get a regular cherry tree that will grow fruit? This has been my thoughts on that. Any experience, anybody else with the bush cherries?
I'm working with them. One of the issues I'm already having is, again, the snows. They just get around them, but I'm not giving up on them yet. You know, I think it could be a soil condition where I'm at. I don't know, but we just planted ours a couple of years ago. So.
Okay. There are a whole bunch of different types of bush cherries too. So do your research when you do that. If you're deciding to try that.
I had a question myself. Stephanie, after 20 years, how wide is your trunk of your trees?
You're muted.
We have, I would say there's what I'm told is a red Gravenstein. The trunk's about 8 inches in diameter. It's older than that, I think, Stephanie. I think maybe it's 20. And then there's two Norlands that are about 5-inch trunk.
And we also have cherries there too.
Right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. You know, I was going to say that, you know, for me, in my experience there, that's about a 10-year-old tree growth is what we end up with. So that's about half of what it should be in size, which, you know, obviously the soil conditions have something to do with that. I was also going to recommend the idea, Michael Phillips talks about in the holistic orchard approach, you know, the comfrey, and I would not use like the comfrey that seeds itself all over. There's another kind. You got to make sure you get the right stuff, but comfrey has this unique ability to tap root way down deep and drill, brings the nutrients up, and then it has like 3 flushes, I believe, in the season, and it just really builds the soils up. And you can do spot planting around your tree using comfrey, and that'll help to break some of the soil and the clay up.
That's really interesting because we have a lot of comfrey here because I used to raise goats and we had comfrey for the goat. I don't know if it's the right kind, but could be. It's all over the place.
Yeah, Jen says Russian cultivar of comfrey. But yeah, make sure you get the right stuff or you're going to wish you didn't put it in.
Maybe that's what I'm... Okay.
It grows very deep and you dare not rototill it.
Oh, it spreads it everywhere, huh?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, I was thinking about maybe doing some comfrey. I guess I won't now.
I wouldn't be afraid of it, Blythe. I mean, we do it. I do it on mine. It hasn't been an issue. Okay. I really believe what Burl's talking about with Michael Phillips. I'm understanding he's going to do a discussion. He talks about comfrey on where he's at, and it has its place. It depends on who you talk to, but I believe it has its place here. And we start talking about holistic approaches instead of the pristine orchards that I showed you in the commercial industry. You know, holistic is natural plants that we use anyway. We're bringing plants in here, so we're not having to subsidize with chemicals. So that is one on the list to consider. But
Okay. All right. Maybe I will still investigate it here.
How am I going to tell what kind of comfrey I have?
there you go, Ed.
I'm not going to touch that one. And
I'll put the pressure on you.
I've learned my lesson.
Pick wisely.
Yeah. No comfrey for my yard anyway, but thank you. I'm sure somebody else will give you some, however.
I have plenty. I
Okay.
just have to move it from one place to another. I mean, it's, but I don't know if it's the right kind.
Well, if you got comfrey, it'll work. It's just you got to be willing to be able to control it. You got to find means to control it. And where I'm at, I haven't an issue with the type of comfrey we have here. And I don't know what, there's so many different kinds. And so I know that Michael Phillips addresses this in his book, The Holistic Orchard. And if I had it in front of me, I could look it up. But I think he's going to, you might ask him if we get the chance.
Someone's got a question here. I heard a rumor of someone grafting nuts onto willow. Don't know where the person who told me that heard that. I have never heard of that. It would be, what sort of nuts are they grafting onto willow? And that just doesn't seem to be compatible to, as far as I.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that either, Blythe. Yeah. Doesn't mean there's not something out there that they can utilize as an interstem somewhere, but I've never heard of that. Yeah. It should be apples to apples, mollis to mollis. You could, I'll just throw out the interstem concept. You can actually get a pear on an apple tree using what they call a interstem, which is another type of signwood, a specific type that has some kind of trait between pear and apple. And it'll graft between pear and apple, obviously, because of that. So they utilize that as a technique, but I have not heard anything.
Right, which does, like you said, doesn't mean it's not out there, but we haven't heard anything about it. The next question here is, my potential site is glacial rebound, basically no soil, gravel to clay, and hard pack. Would mounding be the best to experiment?
You got to start somewhere. I would.
That would be my way of going too.
Yeah, and just you got to build soil. I mean, do the orchard system. I would really recommend the holistic orchard approach if you only got a few trees to deal with. But pick wisely on your trees. Rootstocks have this innate ability to overcome some of the challenges we have, which is why we brought out a few of them. They're a little more forgiving in those types of soils, but I believe all the minerals in there are in there, but now you got to, it lacks some of the other things that are in there, but I would bring it up a little ways. Yes.
I'm going to, in the presentation here in a couple of weeks, I'm going to actually present some graphical information about my plan for putting in 3 fruit trees this spring that deal with a very clay yucky place, a yucky place that has already killed 3 apple trees. And, having saw that and realized you got to do something different, there is going to be elevation involved in actually bringing in soil to do the growing of fruit and the growing of wood above, more or less, the water table. Because the soil issues are one thing, but the water table issue is really a trouble because of these fruit trees generally don't, with exceptions, don't like to have their fruit, or rather their roots, soaking in the water for weeks on end seasonally. And so Sandy Barkley's question is kind of related, and we live in the same general vicinity, and we can talk about that.
This is Larry. Could I ask another question?
Sure.
My wife isn't here to tell me how to write a chat message, so I'm reduced to doing it orally. You were talking about, fertilizing around the drip line. It's something I always wonder, is it the drip line where I've pruned the branches, or where the branches would be if I hadn't pruned them?
When in doubt, go both.
There.
Both. Go big.
I
big, and
would,
also,
in that range, I would. In that range, that's the Michael Phillips talks about that in the holistic orchard. That's where the root system tends to leach out. It goes a little bit past. So wherever they were, that's where your root system is. And so there are techniques, what they call root pruning, where they actually shovel the ground around there to make a circle, and that could be closer to the trunk, and your leaves could be further out. But that's a whole nother topic. But I would just, somewhere within the area, I would go wherever you cut them. That's where your root system most likely is, on where they were, not where it is. So either way, it doesn't matter. I would just around that area. I don't think they'll find it. If it's something good in there, they'll eventually find it.
The idea of a kind of an expanding perimeter so that the feeding surface roots are expanding and going outward and searching and finding more nutrient is a right way to think of it. So you said you used the word fertilize, and I want to caution that because we're not talking about soluble NPK fertilizers. We're talking about slowly composting and developing fungal duff as being the focus of the so-called fertilizing.
Yeah, and that's what I'm fertilizing with. But then as you get a bigger and bigger circle, you need more and more compost and other stuff to put on there. That's
the holistic orchard talks about in Michael Phillips' book. Here we are talking about his book, and he talks about the buffet method. In other words, you've got if you only got so much of one thing, 1 year, put it in one area. If you got one thing of chips, put chips in one area of the tree. You could spread them out all around if you want, or something good on the other side. And eventually you just kind of work it around the system, and the tree will find it. They tend to. If you got a sewer line going down the road somewhere or close to a tree, it finds it.
Well, I'm going to jump in here and I'm going to cut us off. And I thank everyone for being involved in this. We had 80 people on this call at the beginning. There are still 34 hanging around. That's good. So the website cvorchardproject.org has the workshop lineup, and it will change. This workshop got changed after Rob Bishop said, "Wow, man, we got to have a fruit tree planting workshop right away." And so that's what we're going to be doing next. I am looking forward to organizing that with Ed Byarski, who's been providing excellent input here. In the North and Southeast Alaska region, that dreamy, perfect loam shown in the YouTube video is often shallow to nil. However, there are places like Teneke Springs that has really some fairly good soil. And I know that Arnie Strong was on here and Molly Kemp from Teneke. We frequently up in our area have that heavy clay, and how to contend with that and plant and get something going in that is one of the focal points that I really want to work with in this program 2 weeks from now. So Ed Byarski is from Juneau and is Ed's Edible Landscaping, and is a landscape designer who's lived and planted fruit trees throughout Southeast Alaska since 1983. And I would consider myself a struggling orchardist, and I'm the project co-developer with Sue Chasen with the Chilkat Valley Historical Society. And I look forward to having y'all back. There will be a requirement to register again on Zoom. And my hope is that the future workshops will appear as a recurring program, so you don't have to register more than that. But hopefully by Monday, I'll have that set up and people can register for the next thing coming up. And thank you all very much. I'm going to end the program now. And have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you very much.